Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got Dan Donovan back, who is the editor-publisher of Ottawa Life magazine in Ottawa, and he wants to talk to us about how the national media treat Pierre Poilievre. And I think we're going to talk about lots of other issues in regards to the national media, but Dan's got a point of view in regards to what's going on at the CBC, the CTV, national media, and how they're treating Pierre Poilievre, the new leader of the Conservative Party. Dan, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Never better, Brian. Always good to see you. Love your shows, and glad to see that your successful podcast has grown so much. I think it's really impressive, and I'm always happy to be a guest on your wonderful hour with Brian Crombie.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back. So what's your issue? Do you think that Pierre Poilievre is being treated poorly or being treated well?
I don't think he's being treated appropriately. Maybe that's the best word.
Okay.
I'm just another talking head. Ottawa Life magazine, and what I say or other writers are no better or worse in some ways, or maybe no more value or less value than other publications. Everybody's got their content to cover and their editorial positions and their points of view. I've always thought it was important to be balanced, and I think there's a shocking lack of balance when it comes to Mr. Poilievre. I think part of that is driven by the fact that he's an MP from Ottawa. He's been in office as an elected MP and very well known in the National Capital Region since 2004. And we watch him progress, because remember, when he was first elected, he was 24 years old. And we've watched him progress. They used to call him and these other Tories that got elected that year with Stephen Harper the snack pack, because they were so young. And he's the only one that survived. My observation on him is that he has grown into the job. You'll hear people in the national media and others, his critics, who will say, well, he's never done anything. He's only been an MP. And in one lane, that's true. But then you have to look at it and say, well, is being an MP a useless job? Are you not learning skills when you're an MP? He was a minister in the Harper government, so he has government experience running a ministry. He is probably one of the experts on a protocol and procedure in the House of Commons. And remember, there are 338 ridings and a lot of 338 MPs, and it takes time once you get into the House of Commons to learn the trade. So it's a bit of a paradox, because we like to say that it used to be you'd have people who would run for parliament later. I mean, there have been career politicians before, but there is a tendency to dismiss Mr. Poilievre at times. I think that's very corrosive, and I think it's unfair. And I think rather than look at what he's achieved, at the same time, the job of the Fifth Estate, us, is to hold people to account and oppositions to account in terms of the public interest. It's not what we think, it's not what our point of view is that matters, but it's what matters is what we observe, what we bring out, what we reflect on, for people then to reflect on. And I'm quite disturbed and troubled by some of the narrative, especially from the CBC, around Mr. Poilievre. I thought that, and in fact, from the National Press Gallery in general, not all of them. There are people who are proponents or who are try to be fair, I think, with Mr. Poilievre, or objective, or whatever objective means today. But you just look at the David Aiken thing from Global News, the complete, unprofessional, inexcusable meltdown he had when Mr. Poilievre was given his first news conference after winning the Conservative leadership of Canada. And the reality is that Mr. Poilievre won that by a significant margin. He won it with over 400 and I'm not going to get into the tens of 430,000 votes. It was a big win, a massive win, the largest win in a leadership contest in Canadian history. Mr. Poilievre at that moment became the official leader of the opposition of Canada. There's an old saying, Brian, and I know you know it well. It's, well, listen, if you don't respect the person, respect the position. And I find myself having to do that at times with our current prime minister, who our magazine at various points has been very critical of, but I have to, I'm human too. I have to catch myself at times and say, whoa, hang on a second. You may not like this guy, or you may not have a lot of respect for this guy personally, which is probably true. But at the same time, he's the prime minister, got to respect the office. And I have to look at issues. And I tell other writers, we have to look at issues from that perspective. Not everything that he does is bad. Not everything that the government does is bad. And we have to put the lens of objectivity where we can on it. In Mr. Aiken's case, you probably saw the clip. The clip was seen by millions of people. Mr. Poilievre came out to make a statement after winning the leadership. And his press aides told the assembled media that at that particular time, he was only going to be taking limited questions. And it appears Mr. Aiken, who later would apologize for this, so we have to give him that he apologized after his complete meltdown. He seemed to be very offended by this. And who do you think you are telling us, the media, what to do? And we're going to tell you how it is. You're not going to tell us how it works. And this kind of thing. So Mr. Poilievre walked out to make a statement, and Aiken started yelling at him and heckling at him. And everybody saw the clip. Poilievre had to waited and said, "Are you done? Can I make my statement now?" And Aiken continued. My issue is, there was a big backlash online, and Aiken apologized. But here's the problem. Other than the apology, there was no consequence. There's no consequence for the behavior. He wasn't suspended by Global. The Global management didn't put out a statement admonishing him, saying he's going to be taking a break for a bit. I mean, it's absolutely inexcusable behavior. And he pointed out in the middle of his rant that he was the head of parliamentary reporting for Global News. Big deal. It's not about you. And that's the problem with some of these journalists. We've had other journalists, the CBC. We've had two journalists. I'm not going to name them, but two journalists at the CBC. One of them, has a talk show, has a political show. The other is a parliamentary reporter. In 2021, this very high-profile CBC reporter for the National Press Gallery in Ottawa accused Pierre Poilievre's spouse accused Poilievre of nepotism because with regards to his spouse. She didn't even look into the fact that his spouse had been working on Parliament Hill for a couple of years, and they met there. It's as if she thought that because Mr. Poilievre is married to this woman should give up her career. I mean, the hypocrisy is insane from the very woke CBC. And you know what? Here's a clue for people who are writing or journalists. They have a thing you can access now. You know what it's called? Google search. Duh. Just type it in and you'd find out, like, she'd worked on the Hill for some time. So it's a series of things. I noticed a couple of days ago, the new deputy leader for the Conservative Party was on a show, the CBC political show, and the CBC host, the issue was about this woman in Iran who was murdered by the Iranian government. Murdered because she apparently wasn't wearing her veil properly. So these thug nuts beat the crap out of her and killed her. And then they tried to pretend they didn't. And of course, there's a lot of people upset about this around the world. And the issue on the panel, which had the Conservative deputy leader on and a Liberal MP and an NDP MP, and the issue was, well, what is the government of Canada doing about this? And I would just encourage listeners, don't believe me. Don't believe me. Go back and listen to this on CBC. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on the channel. Watch her questioning. I thought, watching this, that she was a flack for the Liberal government. I couldn't believe her line of questioning. And the deputy leader for the Conservative Party was saying, look, we need to be doing something about Iran. and the government's not doing anything, and they should be doing this, and they should be imposing sanctions, and should be. And she said, well, why, why should the government do that? Why would the government do that? Because, that's not really effective. It's almost as if if you listen to it, it's like she's making excuses for the government not doing it, instead of saying, the government hasn't done this. Can you take us through why they haven't done it? It's the line of questioning was just very, very, I thought, improper. And it just led me to believe the bias is becoming overt. It's becoming overt. And that all leads to the issue of why I think, with all the changes in media over the last decade, especially in the last 5 years, we need to have a complete review of media in Canada. And the government's new bill, where they want the CRTC to control what's said online and what people can say or not say online, is not the way to go. The CRTC has a failed record in many fronts already on the regulatory side. Anybody, and if you don't believe me, just go look at your cell phone bill, okay? Go look at your cell phone bill and tell me that the CRTC is doing a good job.
I
And now we're going to let them.
I was on with one of the telecommunication providers for 3 hours trying to get my program updated. It was unbelievable. We have to take a break. We're going to come back with Dan Donovan in just 2 minutes. I'm going to challenge him on some of these assertions that he's made about media bias and about the treatment of Pierre Poilievre. And we're going to have a good discussion. Stay with us, everybody. We'll be right back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dan Donovan, who is the editor-publisher of Ottawa Life magazine, a great magazine in Ottawa. And he does some incredibly good stories on what's going on in Ottawa, in Canada, etc. He is a former political staffer. He's a former stand-up comedian. He's an eloquent writer, an articulate individual. So it's a pleasure to have you back on, sir. However, I got to challenge you on a couple of issues, if I could.
Sure.
So, number one, the Conservatives berated Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, endlessly for all he had done before he became a member of Parliament, was being a drama teacher. And frankly, that's more than Pierre Poilievre had ever done. And so therefore, to say that Pierre Poilievre has not done much when he ran for politics when he was 24, other than politics, is probably fair criticism, particularly when they criticized Justin Trudeau so vehemently for his lack of experience. Even though, frankly, I think being a teacher is probably reasonably good experience in what's important to the youth of our country. Second of all, you mentioned that he's an expert on protocol and procedure within the House of Commons, and he is. So he, more than anyone, should know that you're not allowed to call people by their first name, and yet he's the one that has been trying to get every Tory MP to say just inflation. He is someone that is noted for his economic, financial background, and yet he's the one that's suggesting that inflation is a Canadian, made Justin Trudeau manufactured inflation, when anyone of any kind of financial knowledge knows that this is an international issue. Third, you think about his stance on inflation, his stance on Bitcoin, his stance on firing the governor of the Bank of Canada, and then I read that actually the Library of Parliament had to complain at one point in time that he had no education and was actually asking them for tutorials in finance and economics. So here's a gentleman that hasn't done anything other than be an MP, holds himself out as a financial expert, and it would appear got most of that training through ad hoc tutorials in the Library of Parliament. So why isn't some of that criticism fair?
Well, let me go through that long list, Brian, one at a time, if I may.
Please.
First of all, with the greatest respect, I think you're conflating issues here, and here's what I mean. I don't disagree with you that the Liberals were very hard on Justin Trudeau before he ran. So all he was that, I think the term they used was drama school teacher. They wanted to know why he lost his job all of a sudden out in in British Columbia. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. They were asking questions about that. These are all things that when you're in opposition, you go after it. They wanted to know, for example, what his response to groping a woman was when she was 28. Apparently she experienced it differently from him. They eventually got that out of him. They wanted to know, as you know, in the 2019 election, why he danced around in blackface on 3 occasions when he was 28, 29 years old. So, those are all legitimate questions that they asked about him. And they wanted to know, other than doing his teaching, what else had he done? And those are legitimate questions. And that's, politics is.
So if those are legitimate questions, why isn't it?
Politics is a contact sport. And when I say you're conflating things, what I mean is, it's one thing for the people in opposition to say that. It's a completely different thing for the media to hook, line, and sinker by that line, and then make that the frontage of their reporting. And that is where there's a problem. When the Conservatives are saying that, is it aggressive? Is it mean? Absolutely it is. And the Liberals have said many aggressive and nasty things about both Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Singh and the NDP at various points. The job of the media is to look into those things and say, okay, is there any legitimacy to these things or not? The media were never successful in finding out why Mr. Trudeau lost his job at that school or why he all of a sudden left. The media were never successful until they were successful. They were on it for a while when they found out about this woman who'd been groped. And this is after Mr. Trudeau, of course, as the leader of the opposition, had fired 3 members of his own caucus on allegations that they had sexual innuendo or inappropriate behavior with staff. The 3 of them vehemently denied it, never got a day in court, and were booted out of the caucus and weren't able to run in the election. Yet Mr. Trudeau does the same thing, and it's just sort of let go. And then when it finally did hit the burning cinder in the media, and it was proven to be true, then they went along with his, she experienced it differently than me. So there is a difference between when the media go at something and the opposition. When you talk about, for example, Mr. Poilievre, the Liberals are absolutely right when they say, he's been on the government teat since he was 24 years old. And that can be parlayed into a negative thing by 2 citizens who are tired of MPs and elected officials who don't do their job, who don't get things done, who are driven by process and bureaucracy and not outcomes, and who just seem to be lifelong MPs. It's a legitimate criticism. However, it's the job of the media to look at that and say, okay, well, yes, he was elected at 24, but you brought up this idea that he went to the Library of Parliament to get his information, and the Parliamentary Bureau brought that up. Personally, I think that's a good piece of news to know. I also think it actually, as a person in media, reinforces my belief in some of the things that he is saying as being true, because the parliamentary library researchers are amongst the best in the country. So Poilievre has gone and gotten the research, and he's basing his content on the remarks of the many experts at the Parliamentary Library and Parliamentary Research Bureau. But this now gets twisted into what was the term you used? He has he's positioned himself as a financial expert because he got some ad hoc advice from the Parliamentary Library. You know what? It would be really great if our Minister of Foreign Affairs would maybe use the Parliamentary Library to get some parliamentary advice about what the hell is going on in Iran. The fact that the Iranian government killed 53 Canadians by blowing a plane out of the sky, and this government's done next to nothing about it. The parliamentary office and researchers could give you all the details on that. It's the job of the media. So my trouble again with the media is now we're criticizing an opposition leader because he uses the tools that the taxpayers fund for these MPs, the Parliamentary Research Bureau, and he's accessing those experts and he's drawing information from that to lay his case out. Now, when you talk about unparliamentary language, there's a book in the Parliament called Beauchesne's Parliamentary Rules. and it's hundreds of years old in tradition, based in the British civil law tradition, or sorry, common law tradition. And Beauchene's parliamentary rules have a section in it where what they say is parliamentary language and unparliamentary language. And I could tell you a lot of one of the famous lines was from the 1940s. You know, that, well, one of the members was inspired by, whiskey. You're not allowed to say that. There was back in the early 90s. John Crosby get up and called Sheila Copps baby in the house, and Sheila Copps get up and said, I'm not your baby, I'm nobody's baby. One fellow from Newfoundland get up, an MP, and he told Brian Mulroney that he had pawned his birthright to the Americans. So there are parliamentary language and rules, and it's a very strict thing. Just inflation is not using Justin Trudeau's name in that sort of pejorative sense of calling him Justin, much like if someone was calling Pierre or Jagmeet. It is part of a narrative that they're using to describe inflation. It's a clever word use. It has not been declared unparliamentary. It's a job. So if it was unparliamentary, it would be the job of the media to say, he can't say that in Parliament because it's unparliamentary. But it's not news, and the reason it's not news is because it's not unparliamentary. It doesn't.
Well, the speakers ruled it unparliamentary and has chastened every MP that's tried to use it.
No, the speaker has not said you cannot use just inflation. The speaker has ruled that you can't call. You have to call other members. The honourable member from here, the honourable member from there. But when the Conservatives, it's clever. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's clever and it's working. They're using the term just inflation as a new word to describe inflation. And by the way, the media immediately after, and it's our job to do that. You did it tonight. You immediately went at the Bitcoin thing. You went at the just inflation thing, and you went at the Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada. But I would say to you this, and those are all true things. And Pierre Poilievre, to me, the news about Pierre Poilievre as a media person is that since he is won, or as he got closer to the end of the Conservative leadership race, he started going away from that narrative. That, to me, that signals something, that he's going away from that narrative. Tiff Macklem, the facts are, Tiff Macklem got it wrong. Anybody in finance knows he got it wrong. He was telling people, 16 months ago, there's not going to be any problems with inflation. Interest rates are going to remain low. We have almost 8% inflation now. We have the highest gas prices in this country in 40 years. And the government, the Bank of Canada, have a role to play in this. We have more debt in this country than we've ever had in our history. This government has spent.
The debt's not the Bank of Canada governor's fault.
I'm aware of that, but I'm just making
every
a point.
single
but the interest on the debt is the interest on the debt.
Every single country in the world,
$50 billion in interest.
Every single country in the world has got high inflation. If you take a look at the statistics, and I know you know this, actually Canada is doing reasonably well relative to the UK, to most of Europe, to most of Africa and Asia, and only slightly worse than the United States.
Hang on a second, Brian, because I think the world do, but I got to ask, because I know, and you've, unlike many in media, you've put yourself on the line yourself as an elected, running in an election, which is a very courageous and brave thing to do in my mind for anyone to put themselves forward. But I'm going to tell you something. If you were to go out and knock on your neighbor's doors, like for several blocks, and you try to tell people here that this government has not contributed to the massive problem of inflation, and to suggest that we've got it better than the United States and Britain, we're on many things, we've got it worse. We've got it worse on the price of fuel. We've got inflation's running 12% in the grocery store.
Come on, you're wanting to have policies comparable to the Tory government in the UK right now that has led to the complete trashing of the pound against the US dollar?
I'm not calling for any policies. I'm just pointing out things. I'm not supporting what Mr. Poilievre is saying. I'm not saying our government got it all wrong. They didn't. They got some things right. But what I'm saying is there's a legitimate case to be made for the problem we have in this country at a very inflationary time when people need the money they're earning, that governments are turning around and taking it and taxing it. And then they turn around and they try to pretend they're not doing that. They try to pretend that this carbon tax they try to pretend this carbon tax is actually doing something for climate change. The carbon tax, if you well know, is going into general revenues. It's going into the general piggy bank of the government, and they're on a spending spree. So they're not using any of this carbon tax to fight climate change. They're using it to fund their special projects. And in the meantime, they're putting taxes up when fuel is already high, when groceries are already high. And these are the things that the Conservatives are bringing up. And these are the things the media, in my opinion, should be reporting on. We should be reporting it. As you said, of course, the government, the Bank of Canada and the governor don't have a say in a lot of the economic decisions of the government, but they do have a say on interest rates. And they got it wrong big time. And that impacts the debt.
Okay, so let's hold on a second. Let's hold on a second. So if the Bank of Canada had a very dramatically different strategy than the United States on interest rates, and it jacked up interest rates, before the United States started doing so, what would have happened to the Canadian dollar? What would have happened to Canadian exports? What would have happened to Canadian jobs?
Well, if my name was Jeannie, I would tell you, but it's Dan, so I can't. But okay, I can tell you this.
I'll tell you what I think would have happened. So if the Canadian interest rates were dramatically higher than the U.S. interest rates, the Canadian dollar would have appreciated. Canadian manufacturing exports to the United States would have gone down dramatically, and Southwestern Ontario, the auto industry, and other exports to the United States would have been damaged dramatically, and jobs would have been hurt. The reality is, you can't have, if you're a G7 country, a dramatically different interest rate strategy than your neighbors have. You can't have a dramatically different, and that's why the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Bank, all not in lockstep, but damn close to lockstep, either increase interest rates or decrease interest rates. And undoubtedly, the heads of those institutions talk to each other on a fairly frequent basis, so they know what each other is doing. And so this is a global problem, and it's a global problem that, was compounded dramatically, obviously, by the war in Ukraine. And while lots of people thought that Putin was a little bit unstable, not a lot of people actually predicted that there would be an invasion. People were worried about it, but and didn't think, even if there was an invasion, that would go on so long, and there would be such an impact on food prices, on supply, et cetera. And so, I have a lot of sympathy for the heads of banks. And I go back to one of the things that Biden said at one point in time. Biden said that coming out of the Great Recession in 2000, 2009, they got it wrong. They were too conservative in their government support, and the recovery took too long. This time, probably they were too aggressive, and the recovery was too short, and that led to inflation. So you know what? They got it wrong. Too slow in 2009, 2010. They did it too fast this time, compounded by close downs in China, supply issues, global supply problems, and a war in Ukraine. But they're doing the right thing now. And they're doing the right thing by bringing up interest rates to slow down the economy and to wrest inflation to the ground. And it's governments that cut tolls on highways and gas taxes and fares, and do things like the UK government did that could lead to a complete disaster, because you can't, as Keynes said, spike the party bowl, the punch bowl, when you're trying to stop the party from happening.
Well, the problem with part of that narrative, of course, when it comes to interest rates to start with, is the Canadian government, unlike the Americans or the Europeans, had a housing bubble. And housing prices were through the ceiling in this country. And it is the job of the bank to keep an eye, the Bank of Canada, to keep an eye on that. And they didn't. And they allowed housing prices. Housing prices have almost doubled since this government got into power, doubled. And they allowed that real estate bubble to grow, and they did nothing to slow it down. In fact, Mr. Macklin at the bank and his board and the bank staff, they said, this is not a problem. Interest rates are low. They're going to remain low for a long time. They got it wrong, completely wrong. And so their job is to be in lockstep on many things with the Americans and the Europeans. But their first job and priority is keeping their eye on what's happening here in this country. Not only did they get it wrong, But when they got it wrong, they paid their staff $48 million in bonuses and raises during COVID, and they got it wrong. You say you have empathy for bankers. I'm going to tell you something. I have none. The top 5 Canadian banks in this country, which are an oligopoly, made more profits during COVID than at any time in their history. The average salary of a banker in this country, the CEO of a bank, which is basically an administrator, is $14 million a year.
Let me correct you. Let me correct you. And/or if I said that, I apologize and retract it. I had sympathy and understanding for central bankers that had
I agreed.
A challenge with inflation, not with bankers, because I agree with you. I think that bankers generally are way overpaid.
So I agree with you. Look, I'm not suggesting in any way that the job of the governor of the Bank of Canada is an easy one, or the Bank of Canada. But, you know, Mark Carney, who, by the way, would be a great prime minister, in my opinion, I'm just saying, but Mark Carney, you show his expertise when he was the Bank of the Governor of Canada, and then he went on to be, as you know, the Bank of the Governor of England, because he was very careful about how he did things, and he wasn't afraid to step in a different track if he thought it was in our interest. We're not sheep. We certainly have to follow the financial markets, follow what the other banks are doing. But there's a lot of things happening in Europe with the Brexit and other issues in the EU and the Russian energy problem. You know, you talk about the Russian energy problem and this government. The German chancellor came to Canada and he said this, and you're a business guy, you made your career in business. That's where you made your success prior to getting into this racket. And you know this. The German chancellor came here. They've got a problem with the Russians. That's because the EU threw all their eggs in the basket with Russian energy, even though they have NATO, and the NATO's number one adversary is Russia. Anyways, the German chancellor comes to Canada, meets with the prime minister and several of his ministers, and he basically says, yeah, listen, I want to buy all of your energy. Everything you got on the table, I'm going to buy. Everything. Open it up. Give it out to me. Natural gas, LNG, everything. And then our prime minister gets up and says, I don't think there's a business case for this. Hello, clued out. Where was the financial reporting on that? Where was the analysis on that? Where was it? You know, the oil companies have made billions and billions and billions in profits at this inflationary time. Where's the government on that? Why aren't they taxing the oil companies on their profits? So no, but they're taxing Canadians. They're taxing Canadians at the pump, but they're not taxing the oil companies that are making billions of dollars. They should have a tax that says we're capping your profits because this is gouging. But no, let's tax Canadians. So when the opposition gets up, even Jagmeet Singh has said this, you know, when the opposition gets up and calls the government out on something like this, that's what the reportage should be on. We should be looking at, why aren't we taxing the oil companies? Why aren't we taxing the banks? Why are we jamming it up in the ear of Canadians with more taxes that they're disguising as a carbon tax that's really going into general revenues? Those are the things that the media should be looking at. But some of the media here in Ottawa are obsessed with personality politics. They don't like Pierre Poilievre. They, you know, and there are other media, I will give it to you, you know, Sun Media and others, of course, they can't stand Trudeau. But this is a problem with our media in this country. Isn't it a problem?
Isn't it a problem that the U.S. style media has come to Canada? Isn't that what it is? Anyway.
Yes.
Hold that.
Yes.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask you that. Is that what the real problem is? Is that we're underfunding news desks and what's come to Canada, maybe because we demanded as consumers, is more commentary and less news, and commentary that ends up being very ideological and extreme. Stay with us, everyone. Dan Donovan back with me in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having a good feisty discussion tonight with Dan Donovan, who is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine, a great publication in Ottawa. I highly recommend it if you get a chance. Dan, what's the What's the website? Just ottawalifemagazine.ca or something like that?
OttawaLife.com.
ottawalife.com. I highly recommend it. You had a great
Brian.
cover story on the conservative leadership that I enjoyed and we chatted about. And you've talked about our relationship with China in the past. You talked about policing in Ottawa. You talked about the Ottawa trucker convoy / occupation. So I think that a lot of really important issues in Canada you've tackled at Ottawa Life. And so I commend you for that. Just one quick comment before we get back to this issue about media. I interviewed the deputy chief economist of the CMHC, and he said, yeah, Brian, low interest rates probably caused 10-15% of the increase in housing, and maybe 5 to 10% was caused by foreign buyers. The two sort of things that the vast majority of people and the media, and in our conversation, we have criticized. He said the number one cause of high housing prices in Canada today is NIMBYism and municipal governments and provincial governments that don't fight against it. And so therefore it's lack of supply. And he predicted that we need 1.5 million extra homes other than would be otherwise built. So in addition to natural building, in the next 8 years, if we're going to have any level of affordability. And he said the only way we're going to do that is by dramatic increases in supply, that we're building 50,000 homes less in the Greater Toronto area every year than we need to build. And he said it's flatly at the feet of municipal governments that have some of the longest regulatory processes and red tape, and given to NIMBYism. That's a problem with governance, where local councillors do what the local residents want, not necessarily what's good for new residents, young people, and the city in aggregate, just what the squeaky wheel demands in their local neighborhood, because those are the people that come out and vote in low turnout municipal elections. It was a well-researched and pretty inflammatory and defamatory critique of municipal governments, and the provincial governments had to do something to override that. Anyway,
I just to your point, I completely concur with that, and this is the same issue that we have here in Ottawa: process trumping outcomes in everything. And I think this is a frustration. And again, when we talk about the media and what are they reporting on, I mean, you just articulated very well. And it's probably because you were recently out at a municipal election knocking on doors and hearing to what real people are saying. But this is what I'm hearing they're saying as well, is that nothing is getting done. We can't get things built. We have this obsession, this analysis paralysis, process. There's nobody driving things, punching things through to get them done. And at the municipal level, this has just been awful for housing. The federal government's done next to nothing on housing in this. They've made announcements, but they're not real. A big part of the problem in government today, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, is bureaucrats think if they have a meeting, they've achieved something. Hey, what did you do with that? Oh, we had a meeting. Well, what are you doing? We formed a committee. Oh, well, what's happening is we're having a subcommittee to look at that. Well, when is that going to happen? Well, we need a couple of months to look at it. Like it's insane how process has taken over everything. So people have become very cynical. We need to, we published an article in the magazine from this financial expert a couple of weeks ago. One of the things he said was that the CMHC should immediately start offering 40-year mortgages so people can afford homes. They can stretch it out longer so they can afford to get into these homes. I think what's needed is a federal program, a national program that really builds incentive for municipalities who can achieve certain goal marks within a 12, 18, 24-month period on housing to slay some of this insane process. But we don't seem to have the ability for some reason to do that. And this is a big frustration.
Well, part of the problem is the media don't pay any attention to what happens municipally, or very little.
Well, I think that's true, but the media generally are operating on the CBC want to interpret the news for us now, so they pick these issues and then they're not necessarily reporting on what. That's another reason why we need to have a very serious examination about the CBC, because they're just not responding to viewers. That their numbers have dropped to the toilet. Nobody's watching or listening to them. And this is because they're not reporting on what people are interested in. They're off on their woke projects and everything that no one's listening to. but people are interested in their homes, and they're interested in groceries, and they're interested in gas, and they're interested in the price of groceries, but they're not reporting on those things.
So I've spent a bunch of time in the United States recently. I know you have. It really is interesting. You go into different hotel lobbies, you go into different office lobbies, entrance halls, etc. There are some that are tuned to CNN, and there are others that are tuned to Fox. And really, it's almost as if everyone in the United States is getting their news from two different, completely separate echo chambers. And it's not news a lot of the time. It's commentary. It's pundits discussing the news rather than reporting on the news. Is that what people want? And is that where Canada's going?
I don't think so. It's kind of ironic because in a way, these issues that you and I are talking about today, both you and I are in media. We're in new media, although we've been around for a while. You've now been around for a while, but new media in the sense of the transition from the more mainstream media. People aren't listening to a lot of mainstream media because of the danger you just identified. Fox, my brain melts when I listen to Fox. It's like, get me some oxygen. I can't. What are these people saying? Are they crazy? And then you go on CNN, and I could not watch CNN, for example. I still can't for the most part, unless it's a real breaking news thing. Like during the Trump years, CNN was just we hate Donald Trump channel, and Fox was a we love Donald Trump channel, and there was nothing in between. But that's why a lot of people, especially young people, are leaving these mainstream outlets and going to online podcasts like yours, or they're going to the Auto Life site, or they're going to independent podcasts, or people that are reporting on things that people want to hear about. The real challenge, I think, for the country is how do we fashion that in a way that people are getting information that's accurate or that's truthful. I'll give you an example. Lisa LaFlamme. For me, Lisa LaFlamme was a turning point because, first of all, her audience was not younger people. Her audience, I would say, are people like in the 40s and up. That's the stable. They were getting big numbers every night. Okay. Even I would say to my wife, I'd say, oh, it's 11. I'm just going to watch Lisa LaFlamme CTV. And I'd actually say I'm going to watch Lisa LaFlamme CTV because she represented, just some certainty. She appears truthful, appears authentic, much like Peter Mansbridge used to be. Now, these oxygen-deprived, brain-dead people at CTV who decided to let her go, okay, I'm thinking, you're going to alienate her audience. But they didn't care. They didn't seem to understand how important that segment that they have and they hold were for them. They just didn't care. Now, we will see in coming months whether or not that decision to put a new person in her place works for them. But I think it was the last straw for a lot of people. And now people are looking at other news options. And I hope, and I think we have to avoid in this country becoming like the United States in terms of the toxicity of their media. And that's why we need to have a review of all media in this country. We haven't had anything like this since the Keith Davey review on newspapers back in the late 1970s. We haven't had a review of media. The current government's bill is anti-democratic. It's anti-free speech. It's insane what they want to do in having the CRTC try to regulate what's said on the internet. But what we do need is a parliamentary look into how does this Canadian news and how does our body politic and how does our national discussion and our shared interests and our shared history, how as a country do we navigate that in the media? What are the guidelines? What are the rules? For example, should Google be taxed? I don't know. Should Twitter be taxed? I don't. Maybe they should. I don't know. But these are good. These are the questions, right? Instagram. What's the rule? Instagram. Should Netflix be taxed? But here's the other thing, and the other question in it is: should CBC be allowed to go out and get advertising revenue when they're getting $1.4 billion a year, and they can go out they get this cash cow every year, and then they take that and then they go and chase other money, competing with other private sector companies. They got $1 billion in the bank, and then they get to go out and they pull in another 100 million in digital ads. They should be banned from doing that, but they're not. So these are some of the big questions that have to be answered. Instead, we're focused on, do you have like a pronoun after your name in your word signature when you're a media person? It's insanity. It's absolute insanity.
Dan Donovan, Ottawa Life editor and publisher, thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it. We should do this more often. It's fun and fantastic. I got to tell you, I ended up having an interview with someone who told me that every single member, the new member of the Conservative Party that joined in, that big increase, were males under the age of 45. I had another member of the Conservative Party that said that it was a takeover by the trucker convoy. And both of them thought those were positives. That's another great conversation that we should have
that discussion.
And that media aren't talking about at all, enough at least. Thanks for joining us. That's our show for tonight. Dan, I appreciate it. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, at www.saga960am.ca.
Night.
Thank you.